Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ionside Take30 with a data scientist. I'm Pam Asghar. I'm the Director of Data Science from Ionside. And today I am here to talk to you about overcoming some of the most common barriers to AI adoption. Next week, we will have a BI expert to talk about improving your analytics ROI with embedded analytics. And I believe Debbie will paste into the chat the entire agenda for March, so you can take a look at that. So before I get started, let me just tell you a little bit about who Ionside is. We're a data and analytics consulting firm, and we have capabilities for over 20 years now across every area of the lifespan of data and analytics. So we have advisory and strategy capabilities. I work a lot with that team to help build AI strategies, design, build, data warehousing, data visualizations and dashboards, ETL work, managed services, and of course, data science. So really, if it touches data, Ironside can help you with that issue. So quickly, our agenda for today, what we will go through is why AI? Why do we need to even worry about investing and facing some of these challenges that we're going to face? What does it look like to get started? And then what are some of the most common roadblocks that you'll encounter along the way? Maybe you're already doing this and encountering some of those roadblocks. We can talk about some solutions for those. And maybe you're very new and just want to know what to expect coming up. And then we'll summarize with some key takeaways and questions. About the questions, by the way, you can type into the chat window questions at any time. So we'll try to keep an eye on that. And at the end, I'll leave some time so you can take yourself off mute and ask questions, and we can have a discussion then. So why do we even need to talk about AI? Why is it so important? Well, the tough and very straightforward answer is because everybody else is doing it, right? Every industry is doing AI. Every industry is benefiting from it already. The number of businesses adopting AI in 2019 grew by 270%. And these organizations, who may be your competitors, are out there not only investing in AI, but already starting to reap some of the benefits of it. In productivity, in cost savings, in driving revenue, in customer experience. I think this one is a very critical statistic here. More than 90% of the leading businesses, so if you're a top business in your industry, are already investing and benefiting from AI. So the ones that are the top winners are there, and they're using AI and reaping some of those benefits. The global AI market is expected to reach $267 billion within the next 7 years. I guess 6 years now, it's 2021. And really, people are already incorporating this into their day-to-day work. 25% of sales teams are using it in their day-to-day work, in HR, in finance, in manufacturing, in insurance, retail, higher education. It's really everywhere. And what this really comes down to is that if you do not have a plan to evaluate AI currently, it's time to start thinking about catching up. The quote that I love from O'Reilly, because really, it's not a matter of if you get into AI. If you want to be a successful and thriving industry in the decades to come, it's about when you invest in AI and when you start doing it. So what can you expect to get there and to start getting some of those benefits? This is kind of a journey map. Not all this may happen in this exact order, right? You could do things in different order, but these are really the milestones that you'd have to hit. Figuring out what use case to start with, right? And then evaluating some machine learning technology, maybe also data wrangling technology, installing technology. Now, why are those really 3 separate points on this? Because this is not just one thing where you just go out and buy something. This is a significant time sink. Ironside has worked with organizations and gone through this entire process over and over again. So we're very familiar with all these steps that you have to take. And these are things that take months. It can take 6 months to do a lot of different evaluations and POCs. And then you've got to install and configure and set things up and probably get in a queue in your IT's queue, right? And wait time. So that's a significant investment in time and finance. You've got to hire some resources. I have data scientists on here. I have data engineers, maybe solution architects, maybe even experienced designers. I have found experienced designers to be extremely helpful in creating AI applications that are going to be used by the business. You've got to have dedicated space at some point. Your infrastructure needs to support this. You've got to conduct some pilots and find where there's success and ultimately deploy models. You've got to monitor and tune long term. So what are we really looking at here? There's a lot of capital expenses and there's a lot of time. So again, I mentioned that Ionside has gone through this repeatedly. 12 months, I think, is pretty conservative. I've actually vetted this with other organizations who say that that's pretty low. It's going to be higher before you're actually up and running and have some value. So there's a lot of challenges you're going to hit along the way. And I think this sounds a bit, maybe this is depressing, and it's certainly not meant to discourage you, right? Because we just said it's so important to get involved in AI. But there are ways to help you overcome some of these challenges and to accelerate this process a little bit. There's a survey that O'Reilly does every year that I like to stay on top of and watch how things change over time. One of the questions that they ask is, what are the main bottlenecks holding back further AI adoption? And this top one is always on top year after year. Company culture does not recognize the need for AI. So that's really important if you think about that. That has nothing to do with the technical pieces of AI and not knowing how to do machine learning and not having the technology or the data. It's that company culture doesn't recognize the need for it because you can't get people involved. You can't select the right use case. You can't get funding unless you have people saying, I want this, I understand this is important, and I'm going to invest in it. It's really, really tightly coupled with that second one there, identifying use cases. Because a lot of times when an organization is new and they're getting started in AI, it might be the IT team or a shared service analytics team that's trying to raise the awareness for AI and that they need this and they want to sell it to the business. But if you can't get the business involved, how do you select the right use cases? We're going to talk about that specifically because use case selection, you see it right here, right up at the top of this list for challenges. And you also saw on that timeline, you can't really get started until you do that. So it's a really important barrier to overcome. And I think it surprises people sometimes when they stop and think about this, that it's not even the technical things. It's just getting people involved, getting them invested in this, understanding the need, and choosing the right use case. These two are involved for another way too, because sometimes people will choose the wrong use case and they'll invest a lot of time and a lot of money. And if it's not a success and it's not a big win, that can hurt the company culture. I have heard this multiple times when you go in and they say, well, we tried AI, we tried it years ago, it wasn't a hit, the use case didn't work, nobody used it, and we don't want to go down that road again, it's just not for us. So those two, like I said, very tightly coupled. And then you have some of these more tactical barriers. You need people who actually know how to do machine learning. You've got to have data, right, and sufficient data and enough of it. And you've got to have some technology and sufficient infrastructure for it. Now, these are challenges. They're very real challenges. But another thing I hear companies say a lot is, well, we're about 2 years away from being ready for AI. We want to get there. It's on our list. We know it's important, but we're about 2 years away because we don't have the people, our data's a mess, we don't have the right infrastructure. We're working on it and we'll get there. And I would argue that that is actually wrong, that you're not really 2 years away and that there are ways to jump over this and get started even today. So now that we know what some of these big challenges are, let's talk about how we can overcome them. Selecting the right use case, like I said, is very important, and it takes a little bit of upfront work and thought and careful consideration. If we look at this list here, let me tell you first the wrong way to choose the right use case. Sometimes people will start on the right side of this list with, we know we need to do AI, we should get involved in it, what should we do first? And they look at the data that they have and they say, what problems can we solve with this data? And I mentioned the problem when you invest a lot in a use case and no one uses it, it can hurt the culture. And that's what can sometimes come out of this, because you might be solving a problem and it might be a very accurate model and a great model, but if it's not solving the right needs of the organization or the business, it's just not going to get used and it's not going to get implemented. And so Ionside really pushes for starting at the left side and going over. it's really important to talk to the business. The business has to be driving this. They have to be owning it and be involved. So figuring out what are the goals of the business. And if you can take one thing away, it's probably reading these questions and asking yourself these questions and going through this exercise of, can I come up with use cases by going through this process? So, what are the goals? And those goals are not in and of themselves use cases. It might be, we need to reduce loss. We need to drive revenue. We need to improve our customer experience. Those are goals. But as you go through this process, you start to ask questions like in the yellow, what are the business moments that get us to those goals? What are the decisions we need to make? How are they made? Who's deciding them? How often are they asked? So if your goal is to reduce your loss ratios in insurance, well, this comes down to premiums and pricing them, and those are the decisions and the business moments that will get you there, making smart decisions on pricing premiums. So you move to analysis. Well, what do you need to know? You need to know who's at risk and what's the likelihood of having a claim or having a very high claim. And then you can move to data and talk about what is the data that we need to provide that information to make the right decision to get us to our goal. And so what you're doing is scoping a very specific use case that can be solved by machine learning, but it's driven by the business. And you know that in the end, you're answering or solving a problem that people care about and that is going to help you hit the right KPIs. The other thing you're doing in this, not only selecting the right use case, but getting some business ownership. So that helps with company culture and making sure that you have the data to support these use cases as well. And this really gets us to this 2x2 matrix that you see here. This is an exercise that we often go through with clients where after we've interviewed a lot of business leaders and we've talked about their goals and we've asked all those questions that we've talked about on the prior slide, we have a list of all these potential use cases, right? So we don't just have one in that case, we may have 10 or even 30 or 50. And so we want to know, well, where do you start? Now that we actually have some use cases, how do we know which one we start with? Well, if you get the business leaders actually involved in this, right, you can imagine this as a big whiteboard and you put your use case on a sticky note and they can go up there and really argue for why they think that their use case is very critical to the business and plot it on that x-axis of business importance and business value. At the same time, having gone through that and talked to the data set people as well and understanding the data that can support all these use cases, we can also plot it on the y-axis. Is there data to support this? And so we have that upper right quadrant of priorities. These are use cases that are going to be high value and you've got the data ready to start today, right? You've got the value traps to the left of that. These are the ones where you may have ended up here if you just said, I have data to solve this problem. In the end, nobody really sees the value in those use cases, or it's not as high value as some of the others. And data remediations are very important, right? So these are use cases that really could solve important problems for the business, but you need to go back and do some changes to your data governance, data collection, or something else. And so if you think about this process and you think about all these business leaders and having these discussions and putting the sticky notes for their business problems on this board, what this exercise does is it hits 3 of those top 5 roadblocks that people face with AI adoption. 1, company culture. People are getting involved, they're getting educated, and they're speaking up for the use cases that are going to solve their problems. 2, use cases. Now you have in the upper right quadrant a list of highly viable use cases that you can move forward with, and you can try to avoid some of the traps. And 3, data. So you know which ones actually have the data to support them and which ones don't, so you don't have to worry about that one. So you've knocked off 3 of those top 5 roadblocks already right there. So what about technology and skill? You've got your list of use cases, you know where to start, but you've still got to have some kind of technology working, and you've got to have somebody who knows how to do machine learning. So you can go through that long process. I talked about hiring people and investing in technology. And like I said, that's something that Ionside has helped people do and build their own center of excellence. But that does take time, and there's some capital expenses in there. If you need to accelerate this and you really want to limit your risk and limit your long-term investment, you can find an experienced partner who can help you navigate some of those issues and fill these gaps with technology and skills. So data science as a service is one way to do that. Ionside has one called Ascend AI, and essentially you don't have technology, but we do, and we have a lot of it, and it's not proprietary. You know, there's AWS SageMaker, there's Snowflake, there's auto machine learning technologies like Data Robot, right? And so we can help provide some of that. We have data scientists, we have solution architects, data engineers, and experienced designers. And so what we can do is fill some of those gaps and help you get started very quickly and just jump over that. So you're not 2 years away from it. We've helped you identify the right use cases, find some business users who are can be advocates, right? And here we can just jumpstart and get you started on day one, proving out some value. We built our data science program on some very important principles. One, fail quickly, right? You don't want to invest a lot of time on a use case that's just not going to work. And it's hard to let go of it. The longer you've worked on something, it gets harder and harder to walk away from it. So we have a step-by-step approach. Our step one is called the rapid viability assessment, right? In a couple of weeks, we'll know, is the data really there? Is it really sufficient? Is there enough correlation? Is it worth moving forward onto machine learning? So you're going to fail quickly and find the use case that have the most value. Two is built for scale, right? So in the RVA and the machine learning phase, just step 1 and 2, we build a feature store. And again, this is something that we talk to organizations about when they're building their own center of excellence, right? Think about scale. Don't think about that first use case, but long term, if you want to scale, you can build a feature store that will offer you economies of scale and work better for you long term. Providing transparent and explainable AI, right? Whether you have your own team doing this or somebody else. Again, this is not a proprietary solution or a black box. This is getting you started, and you need AI that you can trust. Your end users need to understand it and trust it, and it needs to be explainable. And so we work under that principle as well. And then leveraging cost-effective solutions. So cloud solutions, AWS, Azure, Snowflake, right? Get a scalable, cost-effective solution so that you're not investing long-term in something, again, that you haven't proven out and aren't sure is going to work for you. So AI, I may not have said this at the beginning, right? But the reason that we catalog all these different use cases is that not every single one is going to be a big one. I think I've kind of hinted at that, right? So you want to weed out those ones that aren't, and you want to prove value at every step. So it's all about the use case. Avoid AI for the sake of AI. Find those use cases that are going to prove value. Take this a step at a time. Be lean and cost effective. And so that's really one of the best ways to just accelerate over those technology and skills gaps. With our solution, Ascend AI, it's also transferable at any point. So sometimes organizations want to use this to get started and then say, okay, this is working for us. We're getting some value. We've deployed some models. It's time for us to build our center of excellence. So think about that, not building one solution for long term, but get yourself started, accelerate, get past those challenges. And so that top part here, this is what we looked at already, always still an option, right? And you can jump over to that at any point. But the value of moving to data science as a service is obviously that time to value and jumping past some of those hurdles quickly. So to summarize some of that, there's really no better time to take action towards AI adoption than now. Competitors are certainly doing it. Like I said, every industry is already benefiting from AI, and you know, your competitors, yourselves, every organization out there, they're going to encounter all these same challenges. But if they're working towards AI and you're not, that means they're already starting to find ways to get through those challenges. Things are getting easier and easier than they ever have before. There's auto ML technology, there's cloud compute, and there's a lot of great partners that you can take advantage of to help you move past all of those challenges. So there's really no excuse not to jump into it today and start tackling those challenges that everybody's going to have to tackle anyway. So you can break those barriers of culture with that very careful, well thought out, business-driven use case selection process, jump past barriers of technology and resources with data science as a service solutions that are out there. So let me pause there and see if there's questions in the chat, or you can also take yourself off mute at any point, and we can talk about some of those challenges that maybe you've encountered that you're struggling to get past. Would also love to hear from anyone about that long-term process here. I've asked some of my clients who have gotten through this, and like I said, some of them say it's really closer to 18 months, maybe 24 months. So this is kind of a conservative effort of really trying to just go from scratch to having value and having AI applications. Let me pause there and see if we have questions coming in.
So Pam, we have one question. And hopefully we'll get some more in the chat window or in the question window. But the one question is that you mentioned that data is a challenge. What are some of the data issues that could be showstoppers?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So on that 2x2 matrix, we do plot data viability. And I had said at the beginning that clients will often say, we're 2 years away because we just don't have the right data, the right infrastructure, and that's probably not true. I have never had a client come to me and say, guess what, our data is absolutely perfect. It's ready for AI. Nobody's data is in the shape that they want it to be in. And most of the time, even though it's not perfectly clean, you can find ways to work with it. We have built successful AI solutions with all those clients who have said our data is a mess, right? But some of the things that would tell us that it's not good for a particular use case, one, inaccurate or just not trustworthy data. And this comes mostly from data where individuals are entering it, right? And there's fields in some platform, and they say, well, it means something different to everybody. Sometimes they complete it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just think about it differently. And so the answers don't really line up. That's not that common, but that does come up. If data is really locked in some solution that's not accessible. So sometimes there's additional work if there's not a central data warehouse or things are centralized. You have a lot of different platforms and solutions out there with data that's hard to pull out. Again, not impossible, but sometimes that can be a significant hurdle. Ultimately what it comes down to is if there's a lack of correlation. So data issues, I don't think are really global when it comes to AI. It's about this use case. You could have the same data set that works for one use case and not for another. And the biggest thing is it comes down to, is it correlated to the target? If you're trying to predict if a policy is going to have a claim coming up, do you have data that actually is correlated to that so that you can predict it? So again, it's about the particular use case, and that's why we plot that data by use case, because it's not like all your data is going to work or all your data is not. You have to take it one use case at a time and say, is it correlated to this particular target that we're trying to predict? I hope that answered that question.
It did, and thanks. And we actually have a number of questions coming in. So let me just quickly ask them. One is, are there any particular industries you're seeing more uptake than others?
Yeah, so insurance, there's a lot in insurance. It's just easy to come up with use cases in underwriting, predicting claims processing, automation. Retail is another one that's very ripe for AI. I think part of that in AI is is like e-commerce, right? There's just so much data, and you can follow patterns, and you can customize marketing plans and personalized marketing and recommendation engines and things like that. So that's another big industry. Finance is another one. I would say all the industries, even things like we do a lot in higher ed as well. Manufacturing and predictive maintenance is another one that's growing a lot. So quite a bit. It's not like even just 10 years ago now, there's just data out there for every industry.
Thanks. Another one, what does your basic definition of AI include?
Oh, that's a good question. because everybody has a different definition, right? For me, I talk about things, I separate machine learning from AI because machine learning is the process of training an algorithm to predict something. And when you do that, it's still what I say in the lab, and it's sitting there, and it's really costing you money every day that it's sitting there until you put it into the business, until a light is switched on and there's automation, and it's either driving business decisions or it's automating certain decisions or activities, right? At that moment, it becomes AI. That's artificial intelligence, and when it's moving, and that is when you're actually getting the ROI from it. Until then, it's a trained algorithm. It's a learned machine, but it's sitting there until you actually turn it on. So for me, that's the definition, is when you get it into production.
And Pam, where in the organization, like marketing, IT, operations, do you usually find ownership of the corporate AI program? And then sort of, I'm going to add to the question, that may or may not be where we're finding, the approach for Ascend AI.
Yeah, it's hard and it's very individualistic, right? So sometimes it comes from IT or a shared service analytics group, and they're trying to drive it and trying to find business owners. Sometimes it's an individual business user or leader does some research and says, look, I have some problems and I think AI can solve them. And they're raising their hand looking for that. And that can come sometimes from, HR, sometimes it's from finance, site selection groups, say, and insurance, underwriting. I think we've done quite a bit there. It's really, in that case, up to individual leaders who are innovators and really looking for growth, right? And I don't think it's that I've always found this particular functional area is always raising their hand looking for it. It's finding those individuals that are really looking to innovate and grow and find cost-effective and innovative solutions to their problems.
Thank you. And in your experience, is the effort to identify use cases funded from the business or IT?
That's a good question. I think that often comes more from IT. I'm trying to think about some of the ones we've done where then it's funded through the technology group and we go out and interview the different functional areas. There was one exception to that. Oh, sometimes there's in one case like an innovation committee that's really funded. Anyone who raises their hand and says, come to me with a great idea for innovation. So that's another situation. But yeah, I think that kind of process comes from someone at the top in technology trying to drive it and find business sponsors who are going to advocate for AI and raise their hand for it.
Terrific. And just one last question. Can you talk on the difference or the need for purchasing machine learning technology versus using an open source libraries?
Sure, yeah. So you certainly could just get started on day one using Python and calling libraries like scikit-learn and use some open source packages. The challenge is that it becomes not scalable, right? You're going to run into issues with infrastructure and compute, depending on how big your data is and how much there really is. And ultimately, at some point, you need to get into things like ML ops, where you're governing models and you have version control and you have different environments, and you need more compute power. And so I think that works initially, but ultimately you want to leverage and scale. Also, if you don't have anyone in your organization who knows how to call those libraries and use those open source packages, you may want to invest in technology like auto machine learning tools like DataRobot to kind of accelerate you that way. And those would be like coding optional tools that help you get started faster.
Thanks, Pam. I think we're at the bottom of the hour.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope to see you in the following weeks. Have a great day.